The White House is now openly saying that military force against Iran is on the table. But what is happening behind the scenes may matter far more than the threat itself. Because while public statements sound firm, private messages tell a very different story. And those contradictions are unfolding at the exact moment Iran is facing its most serious internal unrest in years. This is not just about protests. It is not just about diplomacy. And it is not just about pressure. It is about timing. It is about leverage. And it is about a decision that could quietly reshape regional power without a single official declaration. To understand what is really at stake, we need to start with the part most headlines mention, but rarely explain. The statement came directly from the White House. According to Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, President Donald Trump is unafraid to use military force against Iran if he believes it becomes necessary. She emphasized that diplomacy remains the preferred option, but added that other alternatives exist, including military ones. Importantly, this was not framed as a threat. It was framed as capability. Leavitt also stated that the president does not want to see people harmed in Iran's streets. According to publicly available remarks, that concern is a driving factor behind current deliberations. But this is where the story becomes more complicated. At the same time these public statements were being made, the White House acknowledged something unusual. Iran's private communications with the U.S. reportedly do not match its public rhetoric, and that contradiction changes everything. Because when public messaging and private signals diverge, it usually means one thing. Pressure is working somewhere, even if no one wants to admit it yet. So why would Iran sound defiant in public while sounding different behind closed doors? To answer that, we need to look at what is happening inside the country right now, and why the timing of these messages matters so much. In recent weeks, Iran has experienced widespread demonstrations across multiple cities. According to international human rights organizations operating outside the country, the protests began over economic concerns, particularly currency depreciation. Over time, those protests expanded into broader expressions of frustration with governance. Iranian authorities have described the unrest as foreign-influenced and have emphasized security concerns. Meanwhile, independent verification remains difficult due to internet restrictions and limited access for foreign media. What is publicly known is this: the protests have persisted for multiple weeks. Communications have been heavily restricted. Arrest numbers reported by rights groups are significant. Official casualty figures remain unclear. The lack of transparent data has created an information vacuum, and that vacuum has been filled by competing narratives. This is where international reaction becomes crucial. From Washington's perspective, this moment presents a dilemma. On one hand, United States officials have publicly stated they do not want to escalate tensions or worsen conditions for civilians. On the other hand, they are signaling that certain lines, especially regarding the use of force against demonstrators, would carry consequences. President Trump himself has used unusually direct language in recent comments. He stated that the United States would respond if Iranian authorities intensified their response to protests. However, these statements are consistently paired with qualifiers: if deemed necessary, if certain actions occur, as a last resort. That pattern matters, because it suggests the administration is trying to project strength without locking itself into a single path. But projecting strength externally is only half the equation. The real question is whether Iran believes those signals, and whether the internal situation is forcing Tehran to reconsider its own strategy. Any discussion about United States-Iran tensions inevitably circles back to Iran's nuclear program. White House officials have referenced past United States strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, noting that Iran is aware of American capabilities. Satellite imagery later suggested those strikes caused limited physical damage, but their symbolic impact was far greater. Because the message was not about destruction, it was about reach. And in geopolitics, reach often matters more than results. Iran's leadership understands this. So does Washington, which raises an uncomfortable question. Is the current rhetoric actually about protests at all, Or are the protests creating leverage in a much larger negotiation? One of the most revealing statements from the White House was not about military options. It was about communication. Leavitt confirmed that private messages from Iran differ significantly from what Iranian leaders say publicly. She did not elaborate. No transcripts were released. No intermediaries were named. But even acknowledging the difference sends a signal. Because it suggests dialogue has not stopped. It has simply moved out of sight. So what would Iran gain by sounding uncompromising in public while quietly keeping channels open behind the scenes? And why would the United States emphasize military readiness at the same time it admits diplomacy is still active? To answer that, we need to zoom out beyond Washington and Tehran and look at the region watching all of this unfold. To understand why this moment feels unusually sensitive, we need to look beyond Iran and the United States. We need to look at the broader region, quietly recalculating its own risks. Because while Washington debates options, countries across the Middle East are preparing for consequences they may not control. Several Iran-aligned groups and regional actors have issued public warnings. They claim that any external military action could trigger wider instability. These statements sound aggressive, but in reality, they function as deterrence messaging rather than immediate escalation. According to publicly available reports, Iranian officials and allied groups have emphasized that United States military assets in the region could become targets if intervention occurs. At the same time, regional governments hosting United States forces have remained cautious and measured in their responses. That silence matters. Because if allies were expecting or welcoming confrontation, their messaging would look very different. Instead, what we are seeing is restraint. And restraint usually signals uncertainty. So why is no one rushing forward? Why does this feel less like a build-up to action and more like a test of endurance? Here is the part that often gets overlooked. Internal unrest does not automatically weaken a government's external position. In some cases, it hardens it. Iran's leadership has historically responded to internal pressure by emphasizing sovereignty, resistance, and external threats. State media has already framed the protests as foreign-backed. That narrative reinforces internal cohesion among supporters, even as opposition voices grow louder. From a strategic perspective, this creates a paradox. Internally, pressure increases. Externally, rhetoric becomes firmer. Privately, however, flexibility may increase. This is why private messages matter more than public speeches, because public messaging is for domestic audiences. Private messaging is for survival. And if survival is the priority, then what does Iran actually want right now? Based on historical precedent and expert analysis, Iran's objectives in moments like this are usually clear. Avoid direct military confrontation. Prevent international isolation from becoming permanent. Maintain internal control without triggering outside intervention. Preserve leverage in future negotiations. None of these goals require escalation. In fact, escalation would undermine most of them, which suggests that the loudest voices may not represent the most influential decisions. For the Trump administration, the challenge runs in the opposite direction. Too much restraint risks appearing weak. Too much force risks unintended consequences. Public statements emphasizing military readiness serve a purpose. They reassure domestic audiences. They deter adversaries. They signal credibility. But those statements are consistently paired with diplomatic language. This is not accidental. It is a dual-track strategy. Apply pressure publicly. Leave pathways open privately. But pressure strategies only work if the other side believes there is an off-ramp. So what happens if Iran believes time is on its side? Time favors different players in different ways. For protesters, time can mean exhaustion. For governments, time can mean consolidation. For external actors, time can mean diminishing leverage. This is why Washington's current posture feels calibrated rather than reactive. The administration appears to be signaling urgency without committing to immediacy. And that distinction matters, because urgency creates movement, immediacy creates mistakes. Another factor shaping United States decision-making is internal debate. Several members of Congress have publicly stated that any military action would require legislative consultation. Others have warned that intervention could undermine the very protesters it claims to support. These concerns are not ideological. They are practical. History has shown that external intervention often complicates internal reform movements rather than accelerating them, and policymakers are keenly aware of that record. Which brings us to a critical question few headlines are asking. Is military action even the goal, or is it simply the leverage? Ambiguity can be powerful. By refusing to clarify thresholds, timelines, or red lines, Washington maintains flexibility. By responding forcefully in rhetoric while cautiously in action, it keeps multiple outcomes possible. Iran appears to be doing the same. Both sides are speaking loudly, but listening carefully. And in diplomacy, listening often matters more than speaking. To understand why restraint remains the dominant posture despite increasingly sharp language, we need to examine what intervention actually changes. Because history suggests that external force rarely produces the outcome it is intended to achieve. From a strategic standpoint, military action carries immediate visibility, but long-term uncertainty. Even limited strikes would shift attention away from internal demands and toward external confrontation. They would allow Iranian authorities to frame dissent as foreign-driven. They would compress political space for reform rather than expand it. This is not speculation. It is a pattern observed across decades. That reality explains why many analysts describe military options as tools of leverage, not default solutions. So if force is not designed to solve the problem, what role is it actually playing? One of the most under-discussed elements of the current crisis is information flow. Iran's internet restrictions have significantly limited real-time reporting. International media rely on satellite imagery, verified video, and accounts from outside the country. This creates two effects. It reduces the regime's exposure to sustained global scrutiny. It increases uncertainty for foreign governments trying to assess the situation. Uncertainty slows decision-making, and slowed decision-making can be a strategy. But uncertainty cuts both ways, because while outside governments hesitate, misinterpretation becomes more likely. And misinterpretation is how crises escalate. In moments like this, escalation rarely comes from intent alone. It comes from misunderstanding. A warning meant as deterrence can be interpreted as preparation. A show of readiness can be interpreted as imminence. A delay can be interpreted as weakness. Both Washington and Tehran are operating under incomplete information. That is why recent statements from both sides include careful qualifiers, not because leaders are unsure, but because they know how easily signals can be misread. So what would actually indicate a real shift toward action? What signs would matter, and which ones are mostly noise? Rhetoric alone is rarely decisive. The signals that typically indicate genuine escalation include changes in force posture rather than language, formal consultations with allies rather than press statements, legislative movement rather than executive comments, clear timelines rather than open-ended options. So far, none of these indicators have fully aligned. That absence is meaningful. It suggests that despite the tension, the current phase remains one of positioning, not execution. The most consequential developments are often invisible. Private communications allow leaders to explore outcomes without committing publicly. They create space for compromise that public messaging cannot. The White House's acknowledgement of differing private messages strongly suggests that engagement remains active, even if discreet. That does not guarantee resolution, but it does reduce the likelihood of sudden unilateral action, which leads to a final question for this phase of the story. If neither side truly wants escalation, why does the situation still feel so unstable? Instability does not always come from desire. Sometimes it comes from overlap. Internal unrest intersects with external rivalry. Domestic messaging intersects with global audiences. Strategic patience intersects with political pressure. When these forces converge, stability becomes fragile, even without a single decision tipping the scale. That fragility defines the current moment. If this situation does not end in dramatic escalation, and current signals suggest it may not, then the most important changes will likely happen quietly, not in headlines, not in speeches, but in positioning. Based on how similar standoffs have unfolded in the past, several short-term paths appear more plausible than outright confrontation. One path is sustained pressure without direct action. This would include continued public warnings, expanded diplomatic engagement through intermediaries, targeted economic or political measures, ongoing intelligence monitoring rather than visible military movement. This approach allows all sides to claim firmness while avoiding irreversible steps. Another path is selective de-escalation. This often looks subtle. Language softens over time. High-profile statements become less frequent. Quiet diplomatic concessions occur without formal announcements. To outside observers, it may look like nothing happened. In reality, something did. So if escalation is not inevitable, why does every statement still sound so tense? High-stakes diplomacy often requires controlled tension. For Washington, tension maintains leverage. For Tehran, tension reinforces sovereignty. For both, tension keeps options open. Lowering the temperature too early risks weakening bargaining positions. Raising it too high risks losing control. So leaders operate within a narrow band, loud enough to be taken seriously, careful enough to avoid commitment. This explains why public statements can sound alarming while policy actions remain measured. It is not contradiction. It is calibration. One factor that continues to complicate this situation is internal unrest. Public movements are not fully controllable by any external actor. Foreign governments can influence incentives. They cannot dictate domestic outcomes. This creates a dilemma. Supporting protesters rhetorically risks undermining them. Ignoring them risks moral and political backlash. Acting forcefully risks changing the nature of the movement itself. As many policymakers have noted publicly, external intervention often reshapes internal movements in unintended ways. That awareness is shaping restraint, which brings us back to the original question. Why say military force is on the table at all? In international politics, unused options can still be powerful. Stating that military force is available serves several purposes at once. It deters worst-case actions. It reassures allies. It pressures decision-makers behind closed doors. It shapes internal narratives on both sides. But its power depends on credibility, not use. Once used, the option disappears. That is why leaders are often most careful with the tools they emphasize the most. So far, several things have not happened. There has been no formal authorization for military action. There has been no coalition formation. There has been no evacuation signaling large-scale conflict. There has been no irreversible breakdown in communication. In geopolitics, absence is information. And right now, the absence of escalation is itself a signal. But absence can change quickly. So what should viewers actually watch for next? If the situation shifts in a meaningful way, it will likely appear in specific areas. Language changing from conditional to declarative. Formal diplomatic channels closing rather than multiplying. Coordinated messaging from allies, not just Washington. Clear timelines replacing open-ended phrasing. Until then, the story remains one of pressure, not execution. When you step back from the daily headlines, a clearer pattern emerges. This is not a crisis driven by impulse. It is shaped by restraint, signaling, and unresolved pressure. Both Washington and Tehran are operating within limits. Political limits, strategic limits, reputational limits. Those limits prevent easy decisions, and that reframes the entire discussion. At its core, this moment reflects a broader shift in how power is exercised. Military force is no longer the opening move. It is the background condition. The real contest plays out through information control, economic leverage, narrative framing, strategic patience. Force remains present, but mostly as a reference point. This does not make the situation safer. It makes it more complex. because complexity increases the number of ways things can go wrong, even when no one intends escalation. That is the paradox of this moment. Everyone claims they want to avoid conflict, yet everyone is preparing for the possibility that avoidance fails. We have seen similar tensions before, but this time, several variables have shifted. Public unrest is broader and more sustained. Information is more fragmented. Regional alliances are less predictable. Global attention is divided across multiple crises. These factors reduce clarity, and reduced clarity increases risk, not necessarily of action, but of misjudgment. That is why decision-makers are moving carefully, even as language grows sharper. In the near term, the most consequential developments are unlikely to be dramatic. They will involve quiet diplomatic movement, subtle shifts in tone, incremental pressure adjustments, internal recalculations on all sides. To casual observers, this may look like stagnation. In reality, it is negotiation by other means. So where does this leave us? Not at the edge of immediate conflict, but in a moment where choices made quietly may matter more than statements made loudly. The question is no longer whether military force can be used, it is whether it ever needs to be. And that depends less on threats and more on what happens in private rooms away from cameras, where leverage is tested, where outcomes are shaped. In the next video, we will go deeper into how internal unrest reshapes foreign policy decisions, and why external pressure can sometimes delay change rather than accelerate it. Because understanding what does not happen is often the key to understanding what comes next.